The earth trembles beneath your boots. You feel it before you hear it, a deep, resonant shuddering that rises through the soles of your feet and rattles your teeth together. Then the sound arrives, a thunderclap so enormous it seems to split the sky itself in two, and the world in front of you dissolves into smoke and fire and screaming. A man beside you, Henri, who shared his bread with you just this morning, who showed you the miniature portrait of his daughter tucked inside his coat, simply ceases to exist. One moment he is there, gripping his musket, his knuckles white, his lips moving in what might be prayer. The next, there is only smoke, and a warmth on your face that you refuse to name. You do not run. Your legs will not permit it. Not because you are brave, you abandoned any pretense of bravery an hour ago, but because the men on either side of you are pressed so tightly against you that there is nowhere to go. You are part of a machine now, a living, breathing, terrified machine, and the machine does not stop. The drums keep beating, the sergeants keep screaming, and you keep moving forward into the smoke, into the noise, into the place where Henri used to be. This is Waterloo, the 18th of June, 1815, and you are about to live through the worst day in the history of Napoleon Bonaparte's empire, if you live through it at all. Ask yourself right now, before we go any further, would you have had the courage to stand in that line? It did not begin with cannons. It began, as most catastrophes do, quietly. You were 23 years old in the spring of 1815, living in a village outside Lyon, where your father kept a small cooperage. Barrels, staves, iron hoops, the smell of oak and sawdust permanently embedded in the walls of your childhood home. The wars had come and gone like weather. You had grown up hearing about them. Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, names that sounded like thunder from a distant storm. Napoleon had been exiled to Elba. The Bourbon king had returned to Paris. People said the wars were finished. Your mother lit a candle in the church and thanked God. Then in March, the emperor came back. You heard it from a traveling merchant who arrived at your father's workshop with wild eyes and a story so extraordinary you assumed he had been drinking. Napoleon had landed in the south with 1,000 men. The royal army had been sent to stop him, and instead, regiment by regiment, they had joined him. By the time he reached Paris, he had an army again. The Bourbons fled. The tricolor flew over the Tuileries. France went mad with excitement or mad with dread, depending on who you asked. Your father said nothing for 3 days. Your mother took to her rosary. And you felt something stir in your chest that you could not quite identify. Not patriotism exactly, not quite fear. Something between the two, something electric and unsettling, like the air before a lightning storm. The conscription notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. A gendarme on a tired horse handed it to you personally, watched while you read it, and then rode away without a word. You had 2 days to present yourself at the garrison in Lyon. Your mother wept. Your father shook your hand. A formal, wordless gesture that conveyed more than any speech. Your younger sister ran after you down the road and pressed a small iron medallion of the Virgin into your palm. You tucked it into your breast pocket next to your heart and told her you would be home before the harvest. You believed it when you said it. That is the terrible thing. You genuinely believed it. The garrison at Lyon was a chaos of men and noise and barely organized confusion. Hundreds of conscripts milled about in the courtyard, some in the remnants of old uniforms, most in their ordinary clothes, all of them wearing the same expression, a studied blankness that was the masculine mask of fear. A sergeant named Claudel, a short, barrel-chested man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, looked you up and down with the weary assessment of a man who had seen too many young faces pass through his hands. "Can you march?" he asked. "Yes," you said. "Can you follow orders without thinking about them?" You hesitated. He took that as a no. "You'll learn," he said, and moved on. The weeks that followed were a brutal education. You drilled from dawn until your muscles shook. You learned to load a musket, the Charleville Model 1777, a weapon that required 15 separate motions to prepare for firing and could, in ideal conditions, be discharged perhaps 3 times per minute. You learned that ideal conditions were a luxury that existed only in drill yards. You learned to march in formation, to dress a line, to respond to drum signals that carried orders across distances too vast for any human voice. You learned to sleep on cold ground, to eat when food was available, and not complain when it was not, to conserve your energy for the moments when it would genuinely be needed. And you learned, more than anything, the particular social architecture of an army: who to trust, who to avoid, how to navigate the elaborate hierarchy of rank and experience and unspoken reputation that governed every interaction. Henri Beaumont, who would stand beside you in that field outside Brussels, was your closest companion from the first week. He was 26, a former schoolteacher from Burgundy, with a schoolteacher's habit of explaining things whether or not anyone had asked. He explained the history of the Grand Armée to you at length during the long marching days. He explained the tactics of linear infantry formations. He explained why Napoleon's genius lay in his ability to concentrate force at a single decisive point while keeping the enemy uncertain and dispersed. "He does not fight the battle the enemy expects," Henri said one afternoon, his pack shifting on his shoulders as you moved north through the green countryside. "He fights the battle he has designed. That is the difference." "And does his design account for us?" you asked. Henri was quiet for a moment. "We are elements of the design," he said finally, "not the architects of it." It was, you understood, the most honest answer he could give. The army moved through France and into what was then called the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, the territory we now know as Belgium, in a state of extraordinary speed and discipline. Napoleon's plan, as you pieced it together from overheard conversations and Henri's informed speculation, was characteristically audacious. Two Allied armies faced him: the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Dutch force and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. Separately, each might be defeated. Together, they were far too strong. The Emperor intended to strike before they could unite, to drive between them and destroy each in isolation. On the 16th of June, at a crossroads village called Quatre Bras, your regiment was engaged in sharp fighting against Wellington's forces. Not a full battle, but a brutal, costly skirmish that left men dead in the wheat fields and wounded screaming in the ditches along the road. You fired your musket for the first time in combat that afternoon. You aimed at a red-coated figure no more than 60 yards away. You did not know whether your ball found its mark. The smoke was too thick, the noise too immense, the confusion too absolute. You reloaded with shaking hands, following the 15 motions with the mechanical focus of a man who is using procedure to prevent himself from coming apart. At the same time, to the east, Napoleon himself was fighting the Prussians at Ligny and winning. Blücher's army was defeated and driven from the field. The plan was working. But the Prussians did not surrender. They retreated, but they retreated northward, keeping themselves within striking distance of Wellington. This detail, the direction of their retreat, would prove 2 days later to be the pivot upon which history turned. You did not know any of this on the night of the 16th. You knew only that your feet hurt, that the man in the next field over had been screaming for 2 hours and had now gone quiet, and that Henri had found a canteen of brandy somewhere and was sharing it with extraordinary generosity. You drank and stared up at the cloudy sky and thought about your father's workshop and the smell of oak and iron, and fell asleep in your uniform in a Belgian field. The 17th of June brought rain. Not the mild, passing rain of a summer afternoon, but a sustained, relentless deluge that turned the roads to brown rivers of mud and soaked everything: your coat, your pack, your boots, your ammunition. The army marched north in pursuit of Wellington's retreating forces, and every step was a negotiation with the earth itself, which seemed determined to hold you back. Wagons sank to their axles. Artillery pieces had to be manhandled through the mire by teams of exhausted men. The famous Napoleonic pace, 45 steps per minute on campaign roads, became a desperate, grinding slog. You arrived in the late afternoon at a ridge south of a small village called Waterloo. Across a shallow valley on the opposing ridge, Wellington's army was taking up its positions. The two forces regarded each other across a mile or so of waterlogged farmland, muddy fields, scattered farmhouses, the spire of a church. The rain kept falling. Officers rode back and forth. Orders were given, countermanded, reissued. You were told to make camp, to rest. to be ready at dawn. You lay in the mud under a tent made from a single sheet of oilcloth and could not sleep. Around you, 10,000 other men were doing the same, lying in the wet dark, thinking about whatever it is that men think about on the night before a battle they know is coming. What would you think about? Your family? Your faith? The logical calculus of your own survival? Or would thoughts simply stop, replaced by a low animal hum of adrenaline and dread? You thought about Henri's daughter. He had shown you the miniature that evening, a small oval portrait, paint on ivory, of a girl perhaps 5 years old, with her father's dark eyes and an expression of solemn, serious curiosity. Her name was Elise. Henri had been teaching her to read from a primer he kept in his pack, planning the lessons he would resume when he got home. He talked about her the way that men talk about the things they are most afraid of losing, carefully, with a kind of deliberate lightness, as if by not speaking of her with too much weight, he could keep her safe. You said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. Dawn came gray and cold, the field still sodden, a low mist hanging over the valley. Napoleon delayed the start of the battle for several hours, waiting, some said, for the ground to dry enough to allow the artillery to be properly positioned, waiting for the sun to firm the earth so that his cavalry could maneuver. It was a decision that would later be endlessly debated, because those hours of delay gave the Prussians, retreating northward after Ligny, time to march toward the sound of the guns. But you did not know about the Prussians then. You knew about breakfast, the hard biscuit and cold salt meat that passed for a morning meal, and you knew about the noise that was beginning to build from the French right flank, where a massive assault was being prepared against a fortified farmhouse called Hougoumont. You knew about the ranks forming around you, the sergeants moving along the lines with their sharp, flat voices, checking equipment, checking alignment, checking for the blank-faced calm that was the outward sign of a disciplined soldier. Sergeant Claudel stopped in front of you. He looked at your musket, at your cartridge box, at your face. "Nervous?" he asked. "Yes," you said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "The ones who aren't nervous are either very experienced or very stupid. You're neither." He moved on. It was in its way the most reassuring thing anyone had ever said to you. The battle began properly around 11:30 in the morning, with the great massed drums of the French army rolling across the valley. A sound so deep and rhythmic it felt less like music than like the heartbeat of something enormous and inhuman. You stepped forward with your regiment, dressed the line, kept your spacing, watched the man ahead of you for the pace. To your left, a battery of 12-pounder artillery pieces opened fire on the Allied ridge, and the sound was not like thunder. Thunder is natural. Thunder belongs to the world. This was different. This was mechanical, intentional, a sound that had been engineered to kill. The Allied artillery responded, and then you were in it. The French Grand Battery, a concentration of perhaps 80 guns arrayed along the ridge, poured fire into Wellington's positions for nearly an hour before the infantry assault began. The noise was beyond description, beyond what the human nervous system was designed to process. You marched in column toward the valley below, and the air around you was alive with things that wanted to kill you. Cannonballs that skipped across the wet earth like thrown stones before tearing through a rank of men. Shells that burst overhead and scattered iron fragments in every direction. And, as you came into musket range of the Allied line on the ridge ahead, the rolling volleys of infantry fire that produced their own particular sound, a tearing, crackling roar. Men fell. The column contracted, closed up, kept moving. This was the discipline that all those weeks of drilling had been designed to produce. Not bravery exactly, but the mechanical override of the self-preservation instinct, the ability to keep moving forward when every cellular impulse screamed to stop or run or throw yourself flat on the ground and weep. You kept moving forward. The assault on the Allied center was to be delivered in massive columns of infantry, a different approach from Wellington's preferred two-rank firing line, which maximized the number of muskets that could be brought to bear simultaneously. The French column concentrated its mass and momentum, using depth rather than breadth, intending to break through by sheer weight. It was a tactical debate that was, in effect, being conducted at the cost of human lives, and you were one of the arguments. The charge was extraordinary. Across the valley, up the slope of the Allied ridge, into the smoke and fire. You were screaming, not from pain but from some involuntary vocal release of everything that had been building since that Tuesday morning when the gendarme arrived on his tired horse. Everyone around you was screaming. The noise was a single vast human sound, inseparable from the drums and the cannons and the muskets, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the chest. And then the Allied musket volleys hit the column, and the front ranks came apart, and the advance stalled, and suddenly you were no longer part of a forward movement, but part of a confusion. Men pushing from behind, men falling in front, the column losing its shape and becoming a crowd, a mob, and the British infantry coming down the slope toward you with bayonets fixed, and that particular controlled ferocity that Wellington had, over years of Iberian campaigning, instilled in his men. You fought. You do not remember the details clearly. This is the honest truth about combat, that the mind refuses to record it as a coherent sequence of events, but rather as a series of fragmentary impressions. A face, a sound, the resistance of a musket butt against something solid, smoke so thick you could see no more than 3 feet in any direction. You fell back with the broken column. You found Henri. You found a section of your regiment that was still intact, still formed, and you dressed the line and stood there shaking, reloading, and waited. Twice more through that afternoon, the French infantry assaulted the Allied ridge. Twice more they were repulsed. The losses were enormous, but the battle was not yet lost, not yet. Napoleon had held back his finest infantry, the Imperial Guard, veterans of a dozen campaigns, the undefeated backbone of every French victory, men who had marched from Moscow to Lisbon and back and had never known a rout. If the Guard could break through Wellington's line, the battle could still be won. Around 7 in the evening, they moved. You watched them from your position. The bearskin caps, the blue coats, the measured, inexorable pace. You watched and felt something extraordinary happen in the ranks around you, a genuine surge of belief. If the Guard advanced, the thing was possible. France was possible. The Emperor was possible. You found yourself stepping forward without being ordered to, reforming around the Guard's assault, letting the collective confidence of those famous men carry you along. Imagine what it felt like to march behind the Imperial Guard. Imagine the weight of that history, the inherited authority of all those victories, the sense that you were part of something that could not fail. Would it have changed your calculus? Would it have made you brave? They climbed the slope. Wellington had concealed a line of British infantry behind the crest of the ridge, lying flat, invisible, impossible to target by artillery. As the Guard crested the ridge, this concealed force stood and delivered a volley at point-blank range. The effect was catastrophic. The front ranks of the Guard were blown apart by the massed fire. The advance faltered. And then, the thing that no French soldier had ever seen before, the thing that no French soldier who was there ever forgot. The Imperial Guard began to retreat. Somebody somewhere in the French lines spoke 2 words. La Garde recule, the Guard retreats. 3 syllables of French, and the battle ended. Not because of any tactical decision, not because of any order, but because the men who had staked their courage and their lives on the invincibility of Napoleon's finest soldiers suddenly understood that there was no invincibility, that the Guard could be broken, that France could be broken. And when that understanding moved through the French army, rippling through the ranks like a physical thing, a cold wind, a collapse of something structural, the army did not retreat. It dissolved. You ran. There is no more dignified word for it. You ran south across the valley, through the encampments you had left that morning, through the mud and the wreckage of the day, through the screaming wounded and the abandoned artillery and the dead horses and the burning farmhouses. Behind you came Wellington's cavalry in pursuit, and from the east, arriving now finally at the hour when everything was already lost, came the Prussians. Henri was not beside you when you ran. You do not know when that happened. One moment you were together in the breaking line, and then the smoke closed between you, and then you were running, and he was not there. You stopped running somewhere south of the battlefield, in a ditch beside a road choked with the wreckage of an army in total rout. Artillery pieces, overturned wagons, abandoned packs, men with the empty eyes of complete psychological collapse, sitting in the mud and staring at nothing. An officer rode past without stopping. A man nearby was crying quietly, almost without sound, with the steady, functional grief of someone who has exhausted the energy that louder sorrow requires. You sat down. Your legs gave out with a simplicity that felt almost gentle, as if the body had been waiting patiently for permission to stop. You put your musket across your knees. You reached into your breast pocket and found your sister's medallion, still there, the iron still faintly warm from being pressed against your chest all day. You held it in your fist and breathed. The Battle of Waterloo had lasted approximately 8 hours. Napoleon had committed roughly 72,000 men. Wellington and Blucher together had fielded around 118,000. French casualties, killed, wounded, and captured, were approximately 41,000. The Allied losses were roughly 23,000. In a single day on a patch of Belgian farmland, less than 4 miles across, 64,000 human beings had been destroyed or maimed. Among the French dead, Henri Beaumont, schoolteacher, age 26, father of Elise. You learned this weeks later from a man in your regiment who had seen him fall, a cannon shot late in the battle, somewhere on the ridge. He would have had little time to understand what was happening. That, you told yourself, was something. That was as close to mercy as that day offered. The aftermath was a particular kind of suffering, prolonged, unglamorous, and in some ways harder to endure than the battle itself had been. The French army was no longer an army. It was a scattering of men moving southward in small groups, surviving on whatever food could be found or taken, hunted by Prussian cavalry who showed little mercy in the first days of pursuit. You walk for a week before you reach the relative safety of a town where some semblance of organization had been reestablished. Napoleon reached Paris and, after a brief, futile effort to raise another army, abdicated for the second and final time. He surrendered to the British and was sent to the island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, from which there would be no return. He died there in 1821. The empire was finished. The Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe. The Bourbon king returned to Paris for the second time, and France was required to accept a peace that included occupation, indemnity, and the humiliation of defeat. You walked home. That is not a figure of speech. You walked most of the way through the summer heat of a France that seemed to be trying to pretend that the last 100 days had not happened. Villages flew white Bourbon flags from their windows. People looked at you in your dirty French uniform with expressions that contained multitudes: guilt, relief, pity, and sometimes the specific avoidance of someone who had cheered the emperor's return in March and was now embarrassed by the consistency of their own enthusiasm. You arrived home in August. Your father was in the workshop. He looked up when you came through the door, put down his tools, and held you by the shoulders for a long moment without speaking. Your mother came running from the house. Your sister was there, and she pressed her face against your chest and held on. And you stood in the familiar smell of oak and sawdust and iron and closed your eyes. You were 23 years old. You had survived the Battle of Waterloo. You had watched an empire fall. You had seen the Guard retreat and the sky fill with smoke, and a man named Henri vanish into fire. And now you had to learn, which was perhaps the longest and most difficult campaign of all, how to be ordinary again. Here is what history does not adequately record: the weight of the ordinary that follows extraordinary violence. The battle ends, and then the world goes on. Harvests, winters, the slow accumulation of quiet days. Barrels are made and sold. Bread is baked. Children are born. And you carry inside you something that has no name in the vocabulary of peacetime life, something that arrives unexpectedly in the middle of the night, or at the sound of a horse galloping on a road, or at the sight of smoke rising from a distance. You live. That is the summary. You live, which is more than Henri managed, more than tens of thousands of others managed on that muddy ridge in Belgium. You live and you remember, and some mornings you take the iron medallion out of your coat pocket and hold it in your palm, and think about what it costs to bring that small object home. There are those who will tell you that Waterloo was the end of Napoleon's adventure, the correction of a dangerous anomaly, the restoration of legitimate order to a continent exhausted by 20 years of war. They are not wrong. There are those who will tell you that it was the death of something magnificent, an experiment in meritocracy, a remaking of the ancient hierarchies, a proof that a man born without title could reshape the world. They are not entirely wrong either. But from where you stood, in that line, in that valley, in the smoke, it was neither of these things. It was noise and mud, and the particular warmth on your face that you refused to name. It was Henri's daughter Elise, growing up without a father. It was the Imperial Guard retreating across a ridge in Belgium at 7 in the evening, while 60,000 men watched the impossible become possible. It was the most important day of your life. It was the worst day of your life, in your experience, as in the experience of most people who have stood in the machinery of great historical events. Those two facts were not contradictory. They were, in fact, the same fact, stated twice. You are still in that field if you think about it. That is where history leaves you, standing in a broken line on the ridge south of Brussels, the smoke clearing, the drums going silent, understanding in your body before your mind can catch up that something enormous has just ended. The world you were born into, the world that made you, the world that conscripted you and put a musket in your hands and pointed you at a ridge in Belgium, that world is over. What comes next is yours to make. Would you have had the courage? Not the courage of the charge, not the courage of standing in the line while the artillery found its range, but the other courage, the quieter one, the courage of coming home to a world changed beyond recognition and building a life in it anyway, carrying what you carry, remembering what you remember, and still choosing to be here. That in the end is the battle that never made it into the history books. That is the battle that never ends.